Hello BookTube, I'm Jonathan, and today we're going to be playing a sci-fi version of the Immaculate Grid. If you know what that is, then just replace baseball players with science fiction books, and if you don't know what that is, then here's how it works. So I have created a table, and as you can see at the top, there are features of a science fiction book. For example, that it won the Hugo Award, it was written before 1960, it was written outside of the US or the UK, and it's a book that is a part of the series. Then in the rows, I've added some sci-fi tropes, and these include that the book features aliens, dystopian futures, and artificial intelligence. And so, in order to play the game and fill out this grid, we will find a corresponding spot in the grid, for example, a Hugo Award winner that has artificial intelligence featured in it. And if you have read a book where you can combine those two features, they exist in a book that you've read, you get to put a book in that slot and you score 1 point. The name of the game is to score 12 out of 12 points and complete the entire grid. If you do complete the grid, share your answers in the comments, because a fun aspect of the game is that there are multiple options for each spot on the grid, and yours might look entirely different from mine. So let's get started with a Hugo Award winner that features aliens. So there are a few options here, but I decided to go with a book that I read fairly recently and haven't had the chance to talk about on the channel yet, and that is The Gods Themselves by Isaac Asimov. The Gods Themselves is set in a future where humans have gained access to unlimited energy, a renewable energy source, and huzzah, that seems like a pretty great thing. However, there may be some unintended side effects or consequences of this energy source. And the energy source comes from seemingly something to do with aliens or a parallel universe, and humans need to get to the bottom of this in order to find out whether this energy source is really a gift or a curse. So I really like the start of this book. The book is split into 3 parts, and part 1 just kind of throws you in there. You dive straight into the ideas. Who cares about setup or characters? Asimov just has some concepts that he wants to explore, and he throws you right in. And I really enjoy that kind of writing. That's not going to hit for everyone, but I do like ideas-driven sci-fi. Part 2 goes in a little bit of a different direction, and I did enjoy how unique it felt, but it did also seem like Asimov was showing off just a little. And then in part 3, Asimov attempts to tie all of these things together, and I liked some of the concepts, but some of the things he introduced in part 3 I wasn't as interested in, and the way it is all resolved didn't seem as intricate and as well thought out as it did to me in part 1. So overall, this is a book that I am glad that I read. However, if you are new to Asimov, I'm not sure this would be where I'd recommend to start. If you're already a fan of Asimov, I think it's worth your time. But if you haven't read Asimov before, I'd probably recommend checking out Foundation or iRobot first. But for now, The Gods Themselves goes onto the grid. Okay, for our next spot, we have a Hugo Award winner that features a dystopian future. There have been a few dystopian Hugo Award winners, but for my spot on the grid, I have chosen The Man in the High Castle by Philip K. Dick. The premise of The Man in the High Castle is that the Allied forces lose World War II, which is instead won by the Axis powers. And so it's a bit of an alternative history/future story where we see what the world might be like in the 1960s based on the fallout and the events as described in World War II. And I was really intrigued by this premise. I think it's a really interesting idea, and was looking forward to see what PKD would do with that setting. It does have some aspects of PKD's writing that I enjoy. There's little bits of elements of weirdness and surrealness, and there's a bit of a mystery trying to find out certain things about the world and about certain characters. But in the end, for me, the story didn't quite hook me in, and I'm not sure I connected with it thematically as strongly as I did some other PKD books. Let me know if you enjoyed this one as much as other PKD books. I've read 4 so far, and while I enjoyed this one, I would probably put it at the bottom of my list so far, but I'm still a fan and I'm looking forward to reading more PKD. And for our last Hugo Award winner slot, we need a Hugo Award winner that features artificial intelligence. So I love AI as a concept in my sci-fi books, and I think few books incorporate it better than Neuromancer by William Gibson. Neuromancer is set in a cyberpunk setting, and our main character, Henry Dorset Case, is a washed-up data thief, and he is called in for one more outing to take on a powerful artificial intelligence. So this book is highly influential, arguably the definitive cyberpunk novel, and it coined a lot of popular phrases that we use today, like cyberspace and the Matrix. This book is a little bit tough to get into at first. Gibson just throws you in the deep end in terms of the setting and the technology, and you have to kind of piece together things through context as you make your way through the novel. I think it is very ambitious and one that I enjoyed but perhaps didn't get the full experience out of the first time around. But as I read up more about the book after having finished it, my appreciation grew for it more and more over time, and I think it's a book that I might enjoy on a reread. So if you're all interested in cyberpunk and AI, go back to where it kind of pretty much all started with Neuromancer. So we move now into our next category, and that is sci-fi books that were written before 1960. So these are classic sci-fi books that were written before the new wave era of the 60s and 70s. So the first book we're looking for is one that was written before 1960 that features aliens. So I'm a big fan of classic sci-fi, I'm a big fan of aliens, and I'm a big fan of Childhood's End by Arthur C. Clarke. In Childhood's End, alien spaceships show up hovering over major cities around Earth, leaving humans to ponder the questions, where did they come from and why are they here? So for me, this was a book that really succeeded both on a macro and micro level. I really enjoyed the mysteries, the characters, the interactions between humans and these spaceships. But I also really enjoyed the thematic ideas, the big concepts that took this from questions on a personal level to making me think about things on a universal and existential level. This is another book that is written in 3 parts, and the first part I found interesting, the second part I thought started to get pretty crazy, and the third part just absolutely blew my mind. This is one of my all-time favorite sci-fi books, and I'm happy to put it on the grid. So the next grid slot we are looking to fill is a book written before 1960 that features a dystopian future. And there were quite a lot of classic dystopian novels, some great ones to choose from, but my personal favorite is 1984 by George Orwell. In 1984, we have a society which is ruled by Big Brother and the Thought Police, and our main character, Winston Smith, works for something known as the Ministry of Truth. That is, until he is contacted by a shadowy resistance group known as the Brotherhood. 1984 does a great job of creating this future world which is ruled by fear, surveillance, threats of violence, and propaganda. It is also a story where I really connected with the characters. This book took me on an incredible emotional journey, one that I still get kind of upset about when I think about it to this day. It was highly influential, and it's a book that has a legacy that has lasted long since its release. I definitely think this book is worth a read, and if this is something that you may be forced to read in high school and that's put you off it, I definitely think it's worth picking back up because I think it's one of the all-time great dystopian novels. And for our last book in this column, we are looking for a sci-fi book written before 1960 that features artificial intelligence. When it comes to AI and robots in particular, this has to be one of the most influential books in the genre, and that is I, Robot by Isaac Asimov. I, Robot is a series of short stories that were combined together into a novel that follow the creation and implementation of robots into our society. Now, I'm not as typically drawn to short stories as much as I am to novels, and as is often the case with short story collections, I did like some of the stories more than others. For me, the most memorable ones were the first and last. The first story I thought was really interesting in terms of introducing a somewhat basic version of a robot, but I thought that the story had real heart. It was the one where I connected the most to emotionally and where I really enjoyed the characters. And then with the last story, I thought Asimov did a great job of tying all of these individual stories, all of these ideas into something really big and really ambitious. So I think he stuck the landing with iRobot. And all of the stories in between, even if they weren't my favorites, they each did have some interesting stories and ideas to do with artificial intelligence and robots. So if that's a subgenre that you're at all interested in, definitely check out one of the early works with iRobot. Alright, we've completed the first half of the sci-fi grid. Let's move now to books that were written outside of the US or the UK, which is where a lot of great sci-fi books come from. As an English speaker myself, I read a lot of English books written from those two countries, but great sci-fi has been written all around the world. So we are looking for a book written outside those countries that features aliens. So for this category, I have picked the first book in one of my all-time favorite trilogies, and that is The Three-Body Problem by the Chinese writer Cixin Liu. In The Three-Body Problem, strange things start happening to prominent scientists, and this may be linked to a secret mission that is sending messages out into space. So I won't go too much specifically into anything related to aliens, but this is a first contact story with some big ideas. It does focus more on the science than the characters, which is why this series doesn't work for everyone, but for me, I thought the first book was pretty gripping in terms of the ideas, the second book was just bigger and better, and the third book just melted my brain. If you have any sort of tolerance for hard sci-fi at all, I think you definitely need to check out the Remembrance of Earth's Past trilogy. It's one of my all-time favorite series. Moving right along, we are looking for a sci-fi book written outside of the US or the UK that features a dystopian future. And I could have actually picked this one for the previous dystopian category because it's a classic, and it is We, by the Russian author Yevgeny Zamyatin. In the book We, there is a totalitarian state ruled by the benefactor, which is called One State, and it is devoid of passion and creativity. And our main character, D503, one day comes to the frightening realization that he has a soul. I often hear about the three dystopian classics, 1984, Brave New World, and Fahrenheit 451, and I think that expression really should be the four dystopian classics with We included in that conversation, because it was actually written first in the 1920s and was actually highly influential on those three books. When it comes to the story, I didn't find it quite as narratively engaging as I did 1984, and the prose, although it is translated so it's hard for me to judge, wasn't quite as poetic and as impactful for me as Fahrenheit 451, but in terms of the ideas, I found this to be incredibly rich thematically, and you can see why it had such a big influence, was so inspiring to other writers at that time. So if you do enjoy dystopian books, you like classic sci-fi, you maybe haven't checked this one out because although it's somewhat well known, perhaps it flies a little bit under the radar compared to other classic dystopian books, definitely add this one to your collection. And for our third grid slot in this category, we are looking for a sci-fi book written outside of the US or the UK that features artificial intelligence. You didn't think I'd go a whole video without mentioning Permutation City, did you? It's Permutation City by the Australian author Greg Egan. Shout out to all my sci-fi homies in Australia. Permutation City is a cyberpunk novel which follows a character that through the virtual world is on the hunt for eternal life. So I read this book last year and it was my favorite book I read in 2022. Why did I enjoy it so much? Well, first of all, this is a hard sci-fi book and you can really tell the amount of research that Egan did, the care, the level of thought and detail that he put into Permutation City. And it's the type of book where not only did I finish the book and still think about the ideas, this book made me want to read up on them, learn about them, research them. I was diving into academic papers and all kinds of stuff that I would never normally go to the lengths to do after reading a book, but this book just took a hold on me in terms of the ideas. They were rattling around in my brain for weeks afterwards. Secondly, it's a fascinating narrative with some excellent twists and turns. Every couple of chapters, there was just a bombshell moment, which meant I just had to keep on going. No matter how many times I said to myself, I'm going to finish this chapter and then go to sleep, I needed to keep on reading Permutation City. So I hope if you pick up this one, it hooks you in like it did me. It's one of my all-time favorite books. And just quickly before we get to our last category, if you're enjoying this video, feel free to hit that subscribe button. And if you're really enjoying it, check out the perks of becoming a Patreon member, where you can become one of my robots, androids, or cyborgs like Nima and a New Eden. And for our fourth and final category, we are looking for a sci-fi book that is part of a series that features aliens. So this is one of the easier grid slots to fill, but there are so many good options. In the end, I had to go with Empire of Silence by Christopher Rocchio. This is the first book in the Sun Eater series, and the premise for Empire of Silence is that our main character, Hadrian Marlowe, tells us that he has destroyed a sun, killing billions, wiping out an entire alien race. And some view him as a hero, and others as a monster. He then tells his story, and we join him for this journey so that we can decide for ourselves. This series is epic space opera. The scale of the world building is awesome, the writing is beautiful and poetic, and the action will have you on the edge of your seat. And something else that I really enjoy in this series is the aliens, including the Cielsen. The Cielsen are at war with humans, but there's so much that we have to learn about them in terms of their biology, their history, their religion, their philosophy, and is there any way that we can come to peace with the Cielsen, or is our only option all-out war? I really enjoy the way that Rocchio writes aliens. They seem truly alien, but still in a way that capture my interest and have me engaged in the story. If you haven't yet picked up Sun Eater, it is still an ongoing series, but 5 of the 7 books are out, and books 6 and 7 should be out in the next year or two, so don't let that put you off. There's never been a better time to pick up the Sun Eater series. Next up, we are looking for a sci-fi book part of a series that features a dystopian future. So we've placed a few classic books on the grid so far, but now might be time to add a couple of modern books to the grid, starting with Red Rising by Pierce Brown. Red Rising is set on Mars, and society is divided into different classes. Our main character, Darrow, is a lowly red, and he decides to infiltrate the powerful Gold Society through a military training school known as the Institute. Red Rising is the first book in the Red Rising saga, and I have read the original trilogy, and I'm waiting to pick up books 4, 5, and 6 when book 7 is announced, hopefully next year. We'll see. I quite enjoyed the first book in the series, which has a bit of an Ender's Game / Hunger Games type feel to it as we follow Darrow through this military training school. However, after the first book, it does expand into a bigger, more ambitious space opera. The second book, The Golden Sun, is my favorite, and I quite like the third book, Morning Star, as well. So let me know if you guys are already on to the sequels and whether you think I should make that a priority in terms of picking those up, how they compare to the first 3 books which I've read and enjoyed so far. And for our last slot to complete the grid, we need a sci-fi book that is part of a series that features artificial intelligence. And for our last spot, I've decided to keep the modern book streak going with Ancillary Justice by Ann Leckie. Ancillary Justice follows a character named Breck, and Breck is an ancillary. An ancillary is a being which is a soldier that is part of a larger AI being, that of a spaceship. So I really enjoyed the multiple levels of intelligences. I found the idea that you could have an individual being independently intelligent while still being a part of the whole. It's as if my fingers all of a sudden got ideas of their own. This book also spends quite a lot of time exploring culture, which basically translate to a fair amount of scenes involving drinking tea. And while these discussions didn't quite land as hard for me as the chapters that explored the various technologies that exist within this future, I did find it to be quite a worthwhile overall read. I did stop after book 1, so let me know if you enjoyed Ancillary Justice and whether you think I should pick up the rest of the Imperial Raj trilogy. So there you go, we successfully completed the grid, and despite a strong urge to do otherwise, I resisted the impulse to use Hyperion for every other category. It's one of my favorite series. It can tick off so many boxes because of the variety of genres and tropes included in that series, but I talk about it all the time. I thought we give Hyperion a little break just for today. So I hope you enjoyed this video, guys. Let me know what you put on your grid in the comments, and if you enjoyed this type of video, I might make another grid in the future. Maybe you can suggest some categories and tropes that I should include. So I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, smash or just gently click the subscribe button, and you can find more sci-fi content over here.